So this is the first of today's events, as Pascal said. So I'm going to have a look at a few elements in relation to how looking at the world from a perspective of myth and symbolism might differ from our modern approach and the approach we have in modern culture. And then Monica will go a bit more in depth with some of the myth and symbolism and what it might mean and how we can interpret it and connect with it. So we're looking back to ancient culture and a perspective of the world which is informed by a symbolic understanding rather than an analytical one, which is quite common today, a data-driven analytical approach, which is useful for certain things, but to get a kind of a sense for ourselves in the world, we need something else. So if we look back to this symbolic kind of mythical framework, what we see is a framework that has the capacity to hold within it the different dimensions of reality that the human being needs to find expression for. So we may talk about models of behavior in an ethical sense. Specific knowledge, it could be through different aspects of the natural world, like the property of plants, cycle of the seasons, this type of thing, which are more practical. But also, say, the spiritual needs of the human being. And these are often met through a connection with nature. And more than just a connection with like nature as we see it as kind of plants and animals. It's like the principles that are expressed in nature and that are implicit within nature. And often this is also expressed through, I suppose, a recognition of the sacred in nature. So this is kind of the spiritual dimension, which is often connected with through myth and symbol. So the talk is entitled Connection Between the Earth and the Sky. So it's this idea of connecting to this symbolic understanding of the world and to bring this into being into our everyday lives. So this is the idea, and this is really what was, I suppose, very natural to, or more natural to ancient man. It wasn't a question of the conceptual kind of framework that was kind of, put on top of life. It was a way of seeing things that was just different. So it wasn't a mental kind of enclosure, so to speak. It was a more expressive, kind of vital kind of understanding of things, So that's this, and to connect with that, so it's bringing it together. So it's the reason we see it expressed in a natural way is because it was connected and embodied to daily life in a variety of different ways. Okay, so and we can also see this is another element of how central this was to ancient culture, kind of across the world and as far back into human history as we can go. And it's only kind of more recently that we see this kind of schism or this break from this way of seeing the world. It's quite clear, no matter where you look, that this was a framework that was used for the human being to see and to look at the world and to find context within the world. So as I mentioned, it's an understanding of the world that's expressed and experienced not through analysis and a reductionist vision, which on its own doesn't really have the capacity to address the kind of variety of deep needs that the human being has in life. Like if we look at a sense of belonging or a sense of direction, or a sense of interrelation with the world, this is not going to come from a reductionist kind of data-driven mentality, which is, again, useful. And it can give us certain elements, but then in the end, the capacity to kind of open up to something. It's a different part of ourselves that does that. And often, so the focus we do see in society, the focus is in this kind of, this vein, what is addressed when we talk about the human needs is often the need for, the material needs, which is good and needed and necessary. But if that's all there is, it can lead to, just what's the priority or the pinnacle is comfort, convenience, which has its, it has its drawbacks, and especially when we're talking about our relationship to nature and how to connect to the world. If we kind of live with convenience and comfort as a priority. There's very definite limits. So that's a little kind of a look at a few elements. So if we look back at what we can see that's left behind by ancient culture, we can see this symbolic understanding expressed very clearly. This capacity for a connection to the world which is more meaningful, integrated, and specifically we look to pre-Celtic Ireland, which is what the talk is about. We can look at a few elements here. So if we go back all the way as far as we can in Ireland, so those of you who aren't from the country, I don't know if you're familiar with, I mean, a lot of parts of everywhere, all over the world, we have kind of megalithic monuments and these kind of archaeology from, the Neolithic period. So in Ireland, we have a lot of megalithic structures and monuments from about 4000 to 2000 BC. And obviously there's no writing in relation to these monuments. There's no written culture, until more recently. But even just to look at these monuments, we can draw a few kind of ideas or get a perspective on what way they might have approached the world. There's a few different types. There's like portal dolmens, which are often positioned in specific areas of the landscape. So maybe by a river or orientated towards what would probably be a sacred mountain or some kind of sacred site, and to accentuate that element of a landscape. So you might be familiar, there's a big soaring capstone, and there might be 3 kind of upstands. So that's one type. And then each community would have had a court cairn. So, these ring forts we talk about, so they're court cairns, which would have had a small enclosure and then a cairn or a court that opened out to the rising sun. So again, it's presumably these were used for different ceremonial ritual purposes, but within the community. Excuse me. But then what's most notable, or the most famous ones, they're called passage graves or passage tombs. The like of, I don't know if you can see them there, like Newgrange. I don't know if like anyone in Ireland would be familiar, but and probably, I think we're relatively famous for it. So there's a series of complexes in Ireland, of these passage tombs or passage graves are called, but really they're not. So it's accepted that these were ceremonial ritual centres more than just tombs. So we could refer to them as, I suppose, temples as much as anything else, So, I mean, there's a lot of different things that we could. Okay, so. Yeah, okay, so again, to go back to this idea of this connection between the earth and the sky and creating this kind of connection to a symbolic understanding of the world. In a dynamic way which kind of connects with vital principles of life. These complexes are very clear examples of this. So say in Newgrange specifically, it's located at a bend in the Boyne River. So the river itself was an important deity in Celtic culture, so we can assume that it was a deity in the pre-Celtic times as well. So just a couple of aspects of these. So we could talk, there's all different aspects we could talk about in relation to these sites, but just the most obvious are the astrological and celestial alignments. So we'll just have a little look at them, and most notably is the solar alignments. So in Newgrange, the site there at the Boyne, there's 3 temples. The most famous one is aligned with the rising sun on the winter solstice. And then Doubt is aligned with the setting sun on the winter solstice. And Nouth is aligned with the equinoxes, as is Lough Crew, which is another site which has a relationship to Newgrange in its orientation as well. And so at these boundary times of the year, so these inner chambers are illuminated by the sun. So even in this simple kind of 2 elements coming together, we can see these are deeply symbolic structures. of bringing together these vital principles of kind of the celestial energy penetrating the earth and a connection with cosmic order. And then there's a capacity to kind of to interact with this in a reciprocal way through ceremony and ritual. And even this is a symbolism which resonates very clearly with the inner life of the human being. And even it's clearly meaningful to us, just looking at it 5,000 years later. Monica will talk a bit more in depth about this, the idea of the eternal return, the myth of the beginnings, which is a beautiful idea, which is clearly kind of illustrated by these monuments. So there's also a number of smaller cairns then at the site, which suggests a kind of a sunwise series of ceremony that might have happened at these times of the year. So again, this is 5,000 years ago, and this ritual practice of sunwise movement has kind of echoed through Irish culture. It was present in Celtic tradition, and then in even Christian and folk custom, this kind of tradition of sunwise movement around events and around at different times. So this is, there's an element of speculation in this because it's so long ago, but I think it's not too, they are very universal, primordial, accessible kind of sites. And I just think this connection of this capacity to have a framework to understand the world and to see the world and then to interact with it in this kind of vital, symbolic way is it's a very nice, clear expression of a different approach to nature in the broader sense. So if we pull back a bit and look at Celtic culture in Ireland, again, it's an oral culture, so all knowledge and mythology was committed to memory and transmitted orally. So we don't have any written texts until Christianity 1,000 years later, or 1,000 years ago, maybe. So it's kind of in the middle between the Celts, the arrival of the Celts, and now. So we'll just talk about a couple more elements and then we'll pass over to Monica. So if we stick with this theme of addressing needs that exist within the human being and the capacity for kind of this mythological type framework, and so to do that, there's another nice example of it in this kind of bringing together of this mythological reality, but bringing it into the world and then living within it rather than it being a kind of a clunked on framework. So there's two texts I'll just mention. So there's one called the Mythical Dinshenkas, or the Lore of Places, and then the Leabhar Gavála, or the Book of Invasions. So the Dinshenkas, it's in the Dinshenkas that we find a lot of Irish mythology, but it's put together in a manner that is tied very much to the landscape. So again, it's this capacity of the ancient mind to address this need of connecting in a very deep way to the earth, but it's really the world, the cosmos, engaging these different elements within the human being. So we have this kind of connection with a mythical and sacred history of the land expressed in the Dinshenkas. So we can imagine, this need that the human being has to have roots. It's a very clear need that people have, but that's, we have to kind of find it for ourselves, I suppose, nowadays. But these are cultures that understood these needs and they were central to their culture. And just one last thing, just to mention before switching over, was, yes, the Leabhar Gavála, or the Book of Invasions. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. It's a mythical history of Ireland, so it was written down about the 10th. It was one of the earliest writings, so I think there's, say, 10th century. So it gives a kind of a mythic history. So it was written by the monks, so it has been Christianized, but we can assume that these were the myths that would have been passed down for, I suppose, over 1,000 years in oral tradition in Celtic culture, and then written down by the monks. So it gives this kind of mythical history of the Irish going back to the time of Noah. But just the last of the invasions, so it's called the Book of Invasions, and you have a series of mythical invasions of Ireland. But the last of these is the Celts, or the sons of Meal, or the Milesians. And the people who were here before them were the Tuatha De Danann, which people may be familiar with. These were the gods of the Celts. So in mythology, the Celts come and they overcome the Tuatha De Danann, who are also then the gods of the Celts, which is a kind of funny juxtaposition. But and then the gods of the Celts become related to these sacred sites in a variety of ways. So when the Celts overcome them, the gods take the other world or the underworld, so they're always there present in the landscape. But there's another, so when they first arrive, their chief bard, Amergin, he arrives to do battle, but they're pushed back beyond, like a storm is raised by the Tuatha De Danann, this kind of magical storm, and to overcome it, Amergin recites this poem called A Song of Amergin. And I picked it just because it's a very simple, like we're talking about some symbolism and myth and this type of thing, but I think it's a very clear, simple kind of way of connecting with that idea that we can all kind of relate to. So when the Song of Amergin goes, so he's on the prow of the ship, pushed back beyond the ninth wave, and he says, I am a wind in the sea, I am a sea wave upon the land, I am the sound of the sea, I am a stag of 7 combats, I am a hawk upon a cliff. And it continues on in this kind of way. So it's like I suppose, expansion out to nature, so we can kind of, or to nature and the world. So it's like this, I think it gives a nice, expresses an understanding of, to connect with nature, there is a kind of a reciprocal kind of movement where we bring it back inside, for want of a better word. And that's kind of that's me. So I'll pass over to Monica and she'll give you some more illuminating insights.
Thank you, Derek. So I wanted to go a little bit more into, like Derek suggested, mythology and the symbolism. And maybe to start with, what is the difference between history and mythology? Because I suppose if we want to connect with a culture, with a country, normally probably the first starting point is to find out about the history. But I would suggest to look into the mythology of a civilization. Maybe gives us a better insight, because it's almost like myth is a window into the soul of a nation, because it represents how they've seen nature, how they see their origin, what inspires them. So normally there's 2 types of myth. So it's origin myth, which is the origin of the universe, but also the origin of the culture, of the civilization. And then there's the heroic myth. So I'm going to refer briefly to a couple of origin myths, which are maybe not we're maybe not as familiar with, or how to read it, because the heroic myth is maybe something that is a little bit more familiar to ourselves. But myth in general, and particularly origin myths, talk about the time before time, okay? So before things came into existence, but they do talk about this idea of things have existed, just in a different state. So the idea of potential that then becomes manifested, becomes visible, let's say. And as a kind of a practical example, it's like the idea of, the hazelnut tree is a important, it's one of the sacred trees of Ireland. And in the little hazelnut is the potential of the tree. It's similar in that kind of idea, okay? So there's also oftentimes, when you look at origin myth, there's the idea of this primordial substance that contains everything, but also the cosmic egg or the cosmic womb, And for those who maybe have visited the sites, we see these kind of egg-shaped structures in different parts and places. And it's obviously, I would assume there's a natural connection, with that symbol. And so one of the myths is, or story, folklore is the Cailleach which is from Loch Cree, which is the hag. the mountain of the witch. I think it's if you have the next slide, it's not, you can't see it that clear. So the story is that it's the hag who has an apron which is full of rocks and stones, which represents this idea of the time before time, the potential. And she takes 3 steps, and on the 3 steps that she takes in that area, she drops the rocks which form those 3 mountains or 3 hills. Which is Carnbane West, Carrick Brack, and Parricks Town. Okay, and this is, and it's, even if you kind of read a little bit about that myth, it's described that her apron is this cosmic womb. This presents the potential. Yeah, and there's another legend or myth that is related to this era. And it's which is in the Boyne Valley. And we're talking about that the megalithic structures like Newgrange and so on. So the Boyne is the important river in Ireland, and is related to the goddess Boen, which means the white cow. So she's also related to the Milky Way. Okay, so next slide. We have it. Yeah. So it's also called Bealach Born Finne, which is the way of the white cow. And the myth is that that the goddess approached the origin well, which is the Nectane well, and as she approached, it overflowed and it created the river Boyne, which is the earthly representation of the celestial Milky Way. And like Derek said, we don't have a lot of writings from that time in Ireland, but there is a goddess in Egypt which symbolizes the same thing, which is the goddess Nut, and I have just found a couple of images there. So she also represents the Milky Way. She's represented like a goddess, as you see here, sometimes referred to as a cow in the upper picture there, which has the Milky Way on her belly, yeah, which is protecting the earth, which is oftentimes what you find symbolically connected with the feminine, this idea of protection of the earth. So I'm just drawing a couple of sort of similarities there because there are similarities between those goddesses, and we have a little bit more writings of Egypt. It's easy maybe to assume that they symbolized the same things. You know? And this idea of, because we find this a lot in mythology, and that different symbols are connected with different natural phenomena, but the natural world and the celestial as well. And this invites, I think, to a reflection on what do the different elements in nature represent and what can we learn from them, you know? What do rivers, for example, represent versus trees or rocks? Mountains and so on. They all represent different qualities. Rivers, for example, if you think about it normally, represents life. Like in the Nile, for example, in Egypt was the source of life really for the civilization there, and the Boyne is a very important river. So it's life, it's purification, it creates connections, but vitality really. Yeah. And to think about, because I think this is what comes across in all the mythologies, like Derek was saying, that nature was really seen as a living organism, living being, not just the things that we immediately associate with what is alive, but also stones, rocks. And just for your own kind of reflection, because I know we're running a little bit out of time, but to think about, in what way you think seeing nature as a living organism in all its aspects, in what way does that impact, let's say, our interaction with it versus to how it was in ancient times, where this was maybe a little bit more a part of their everyday life. And when we observe nature, one of the first things in all civilizations really that comes across in myth and even in the texts is this idea of cycles and the importance of cycles in the journey of wisdom. Okay, Because cycles we observe everywhere in nature, day, night, and the seasons, but also life and death, so birth and then rebirth ultimately. So we see everything is cyclical. And there's lots of, in all civilizations, there's also a lot of ceremonies around these important points, like we have here, and the examples that Derek gave. But there's also ceremonies and rituals around those times of the year. And they're normally held not only in those specific megalithic structures, but also around sacred trees or wells and so on. So part of nature very much. And I want to talk about, kind of as the last aspect, the myth of probably people know, the famous salmon of knowledge, which is at the same time, And I want to offer a few keys of interpretation.
Maybe not.
Keys of interpretation, so I'll be short because probably people know it, but because it's at the same time, for me, it's a very interesting myth because it's kind of a heroic myth. It talks about Finn McCool, of course, eating the salmon of knowledge, but it's at the same time, I think it's also an original, so it's very multi-layered. But just for our recollection, for those who don't know, so the tale begins with the old wise bard Finn, who lived close to the River Boyne. And the River Boyne was home to the salmon of knowledge, who became wise because 9 hazelnuts from the famous tree of wisdom. Okay, and it said that whoever ate the salmon would gain knowledge of all the world. Okay, so we have the salmon represents wisdom, but also the trees and the nuts, for example. Okay, so we have a couple of some symbols there. And Fintan tried to catch it, and there was many kind of unsuccessful attempts. And then eventually he caught it, and he gave it to his apprentice, Finn McCool. And he said to him, "You can't eat, the salmon." And so he was very careful, and he cooked it, but then there was a little blister that burst, and he, to soothe the pain, he put the finger into his mouth, and therefore he obtained some of the wisdom. So Fintan then said that, because he realized and he saw the wisdom in his eyes, I think it's very poetically, beautifully said, said, "Okay, you may now eat the full salmon." Okay. So there are some interpretations that also say that at the same time, Fintan is also the salmon. Okay, so he represents also wisdom because he also is referred to as the survivor after the flood, living for hundreds of years. He was described as a shape shifter, so that's why there is this association that he might have been the salmon himself. Okay, and so this idea, so there's a lot of aspects in there which refer to the idea of cycles or different stages of, let's say, manifestation or transmission, because we see the wisdom represented in the salmon, in the nuts themselves, in the tree, and trees have symbolically always been symbols of wisdom because they last, some of them, hundreds of years, which means many, many lifetimes. And in Irish history or in mythology, there's this idea of, like Derek mentioned, that trees being sacred because they've been also a witness to the clan that lives around, for example, and rituals and decisions and judgments made around trees and so on. So there's a cyclicity that is seen, for example, in the life of a tree. And also they are a symbol of longevity. And the other aspect that's interesting with the nuts, and so the salmon eating the nuts, and then that becoming a symbol of wisdom, also suggests this idea that we can't really absorb or know anything until we have digested and made it part of ourselves. Okay, and that's really what's symbolized here. That this idea of transmission, And so there's a story quote that kind of this reminded me of, which is, you see the wisdom of the sheep and the wool it produces. Yeah, it receives it eats the grass and has the sunlight and drinks the water and so on, but it doesn't give the same thing back. It gives what it can and what is the best that it can produce, which is the wool, which is really in a way what the journey of wisdom is. I'm always reminded, we were saying at the beginning, the classes we do our classes, we teach the ancient philosophies, different subjects every week, and everybody hears the same, let's say, what is being shared, the same the teachings, but how they are applied, we have to make that ourselves, our own journey, of how to take those keys and to bring them to life through our actions. Okay. So this is really what this represents as well, because the idea of transmitting something that is of value is obviously represented in the oral tradition of mythology. But how do we make something ours is then also represented in the idea of the salmon, which is swimming upstream. Okay, so it starts at the origin of that, at the well, at the origin of, or the source of the river. It's this journey of life for multiple lifetimes, let's say. But then the salmon also always comes back to the essence. So it's important for us to kind of reconnect with this. Is what is it that is essential for us? What is essentially human? Or even for ourselves, what is our essence? What are the values, the qualities, let's say, that we want to uphold, that we want to manifest in our actions? And do we do that? Yeah, so this is the symbolic, like the return to what is essential, so I can redirect my actions according to what is my essence. Okay, it's really what this symbolizes. And yeah, I think we're kind of.
Yeah, I think that was very interesting. I mean,
I'm trying a little. Yeah, but did you want to say?
Just what you were saying, about that, the myth of the salmon of knowledge. It's just you have this repetition of an articulation of the idea of wisdom, of digesting wisdom. So you have the river Boyne, which is the goddess, reflecting the Milky Way. You have the salmon, which swims upstream to the source, which is to go against the current, which is a kind of aspect of wisdom. And then the idea of going back to the source, the tree, and then these 9 trees that symbolize wisdom, and the nuts with the hard nut that you have to be digested by the salmon, and they have to be broken open because they're a hard shell with knowledge within. And it's just that this repetition of digestion and returning to the source, I think, is it's really nice image.
Thank you.